everyone. If you are watching this, that means you are tuned in to a conversation about equity and rural communities. And I am joined here today, very excited to be joined by the Vice President of Consulting at Community Science, Kien Lee. And what we'll talk about today is just her experience and expertise in conducting evaluations, capacity strengthening, community building at the intersection of equity and rural communities and environments. And before we get started with our conversation today, which I think is very timely, I want to pause and allow Kien Lee to introduce herself and just share a little bit about what she does at Community Science and about who she is in her own words. And so, Kien, please take it away.
Thank you, Faith. I'm so glad to be here today. As Faith said, I'm Kien Lee. I'm the Vice President of Consulting here at Community Science. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of BCT Partners. I lead the team here of about 26 of us doing work to provide research, evaluation, and capacity strengthening services to public, private, and nonprofit agencies and organizations with a very clear lens on equity. Community science is all about building healthy, just, and equitable communities. So we really work very hard to put this lens to equity in a way that's practical and operationable. So it's not just about a value. It's not just about something we aspire to. It's really about how to do it and how to do it well every day in our work.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Kien, for getting us started with that. And it is a point of pride and just excitement at Community Science that we bring that lens of like practicality. We know how to do the how and how to implement. And so we'll get to that in a little bit. But first, I want to just kind of back us up a little bit and sort of ask you, Kien, what initially drew you to work at the intersection of equity and rural communities? We know that sometimes rural communities are left out of the conversation about equity, and sometimes they're like an afterthought. And we know that you have deep experience and expertise in this area. And so just want to know, like, what were some of your motivations or what kind of got you into this lane per se?
I would say that, it's about inclusion, right? Which communities do we include? Which communities do we exclude when we are thinking about, access to opportunities and resources? And it always struck me that rural communities were excluded, and we work in them. So it's not as if we don't work in rural communities. We work in them through all our projects. When you have grant projects that are part of a larger initiative evaluation, some of the projects take place in rural settings. So it struck me that, it's clearly timely, the conversations we've been having in the last few years in this nation about communities that are left out, especially in the rural space, because they're stereotyped for so many things, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I'll start. And so in addition to that, I'll say that, if community science, we define equity as people having fair access to opportunities and resources so that they can achieve their full potential. The conditions and capacities that would enable people to take advantage of this access, right? Just because you have access doesn't mean that you always have the ability to take advantage of that access. And their rights to these opportunities and resources, free from any type of discrimination as deemed by law and from the prejudices of others. So we apply this definition to equity, then it's only natural that we not only look at the intersection of race and ethnicity, gender and sexual identities and disability, but also rural. If we think about it, people who live in rural settings don't have easy access to broadband, healthcare, education, and jobs. They have to contend with stereotypes and biases about them. And the populations I mentioned, identities based on race, ethnicity, gender, etc., people live in rural communities, not just urban, right? So why not look at intersections that also include rural? So it's the experience I've seen in communities. It's the logical thing when we think about who's getting left out often. And it's also the recognition that these intersections exist everywhere in every community.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for just kind of getting us started with first the definition of equity, like how community science thinks about this large term that can really be taken in so many different directions and conflated with other terms, right? And so thank you for getting us grounded there. And then also being careful to talk about the distinction between like access, but what you actually have advantage to really like get into, which is really important. And you think about some of the barriers and misconceptions, right, of folks in rural communities. So you talked about projects, right, that are based based in rural communities. And so we're already working in these places and spaces. Can you just share a little bit about like specific experiences or maybe a project or two that have really helped to shape that understanding of equity in rural communities and what the specific needs might be for folks?
Yeah, two projects definitely come to mind. One is the evaluations that we've done in Colorado for the Colorado Trust. We've evaluated the Colorado Trust Immigrant Integration Initiative, Health Equity Initiative, more recently the Community Partnerships for Health Equity Initiative, and I know we're also evaluating the Building and Bridging Power Initiative for the Trust. And the trust work takes place all over the state, including frontier and rural communities. And some of these places can be pretty isolated. As I travel through the state to conduct site visits, I've learned the scarcity of healthcare services in some of these rural places. In many cases, there was only one clinic in town, and that served everybody. And it's a diverse population on top of that. So one clinic trying to serve the needs of a very diverse population. Also, really, from driving all over the state, experience firsthand the long distances you have to travel, right? And people have to travel to attend trainings of all sorts because these trainings that they have to attend, whether it's for their jobs, for certification, for anything like that, they often occur in the biggest town near them, which really isn't that near actually. So, it's really understanding how all of these create a different kind of challenge for people who live in rural communities. Another evaluation is one that we're doing for the Kellogg Foundation's work in Mississippi, which included the Delta area, which is a very rural setting. I drove to the area to a center that served young people one day and that provides after school services to these young people. I drove up to it. It was a small center, maybe had two large rooms, if I recall, and some very basic furniture. And it just struck me as it's such a contrast to the types of facilities we see in urban areas. And when our youth go to for after school activities, where you have all kinds of facilities, all kinds of equipment, all these spaces that, the kids can run around and do different things. So to me, it really showed me how different it is. And this is just the physical side of it. I haven't even
Mhm.
talked about the cultural side of it, how people, know each other, the relationships and all of that. So I think these projects really have shaped my understanding and appreciation for the cultures in rural communities, the challenges, the assets. It's not always just, it shouldn't be a deficiency framework. It's also the
Yes.
assets, right? And it's therefore how they are able to pool the limited resources they have to do what they have to do and to take care of themselves. And so there's those assets and what I call the geographic disparities that they experience in these settings. So it's really deepened my appreciation for it over time through all these projects that we have.
Yeah, thank you for that thoughtful answer, Kian. And just bringing in two very distinct and tangible experiences of kind of what has grounded or informed your understanding of equity in rural communities, right? You brought in Colorado, you brought in
Mhm,
Mississippi, and also, what I'm really just sitting with is the physical aspect of your engagement in these communities because it takes that, right, to be able
mhm,
to see the distance between the interview site, right, and where folks are
mhm,
situated in their own neighborhood and personal community. So just thinking about the just automatic disparities and gaps in equity, right, for
mhm.
folks who are in those settings. And so, yeah, just really giving appreciation. Thank you for laying that out for us so well. And so I want to kind of pull on a thread that came up in your introduction, which is some of the misconceptions that are out here, right,
Mhm.
in this environment or in the field about rural communities and the challenges of achieving equity in these settings. And I want to ask like what your personal professional experiences are in that realm in terms of, the misconceptions that you've heard and how we can
Yeah.
sort of debunk some myths.
Yeah. Um, I think the big misconception is that rural communities are homogenous. I mean, we hear that so much, right? The stereotype that they're white, they're uneducated, they're poor, they're politically conservative, and even that they're made up mostly of supporters of Trump. On the contrary, I think there have been studies, and Ulrich Schad and Duncan are two researchers that showed this, that they're actually very different, and they're different types of rural communities, and they're not all the same. And they name three types. Rural communities that are what we call amenity rich with lots of natural resources. lakes, mountains that attract people who want an outdoor lifestyle. In these communities, you actually have a lot of people migrating from cities to these places, and they drive the cost of housing up and they change the makeup of the communities. Um, it's a different kind of rural community. It's got a different culture, it's got different makeup, it's changing. I was in Amherst, Massachusetts not long ago, and there were homes out there going for about $1.5 million. And it's a very small community with lots of farms. And when I asked, I was told that, the pandemic kind of facilitated that when people wanted to move to quiet places and get away from the stress of being in urban settings during the pandemic. And they drove the housing up because they were coming from large urban communities and they could afford a lot more. That affects those communities, and that's a context we have to wrestle with when we're doing work in those communities. The second type of rural communities is those that are transitioning because their residents' economic stability depends on jobs connected to agriculture, mining, timber, manufacturing. So, when these sectors change, when these industries change, these communities' economic, environments change. And so that is something else, again, we have to take into consideration. And then the third one are those communities that are chronically poor and experience population loss and weak sense of community because they never recovered from the loss of a major employer. When we were evaluating some the community partnerships for health equity work in Colorado, we came across a lot of these communities, and they were supposed to deal with social determinants of health. And one of the social determinants of health that repeatedly came up was this sort of sense of community cohesion. And that's because they've experienced that population loss because some major employer left their community for whatever reason. And so they went into an economic decline, and their younger people had to leave to find jobs elsewhere and things like that. So these are all different types of rural communities. They have different demographic makeup, which really means they're pretty diverse as a whole. Um, the 2020 census showed that almost 1/4 of rural populations is made up of people of color, including people who migrate from Mexico, Central America, and South America to come work in our meat packing plants, vegetable and fruit farms, and to harvest timber. Right? Indigenous communities are the largest population of color in rural areas in eastern Oklahoma and in Alaska. And, sometimes we forget there are Filipino communities in Alaska because they came for jobs in the fishing and canning industries. They stayed, they established communities there. Nearly 10% of residents in Appalachia are Black, right? That's the history of Black communities out there. So we're talking about like so many different forms of identities here. And now we're just touching on race and ethnicity, but then you overlay that with different gender and sexual identities and different abilities and disabilities. You're going to get a lot of diversity in rural communities. So why do we make such gross generalizations about rural communities?
Yeah, that's actually really fantastic, Kien. You gave us some research, you gave us a history lesson, all in response to this question about some of the misconceptions. And one thing that I really appreciate about what you've said is just how we can tend to invisibilize groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
And certain identities who are existing in these rural places, right? So we're thinking about it in terms of race and gender, like you said, and ethnicity, but also like invisibilizing some of the resources, natural resources that exist in these communities and bring a certain measure of wealth and stability, right? And also just real estate, talking about homes that exist in these communities that we aren't even privy to that are really contributing to the economy again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love how you're bringing in this idea that what you see in mainstream may not be the totality of what exists. And we need to
Mm-hmm.
be mindful of that when we're, especially as evaluators, right, thinking about conducting these kinds of research
Yeah.
projects. And so thank you so much for that. I also want to kind of talk about, now that we've sort of set the context a little bit, I want to talk about what are the opportunities for growth and development in rural communities, and then how they can be maximized to address some of the existing challenges you started to touch on.
Yeah. The opportunities for growth and development in rural communities are dependent on so many factors that are shaped by like political, economic, social, cultural forces, not only in the US, but globally. I'm not an expert in rural community development. There are plenty of people who can speak to this better, so I'm not even going to try. I think the opportunity I see here as an evaluator is how we can actually help curate a better and more accurate understanding of rural communities, and really develop our own cross-cultural competencies to be able to work in rural settings. There's been so much work in the last, decade about culturally competent evaluations, equitable evaluations, and how we expect ourselves to develop competencies to work in communities of color, in LGBTQ plus communities, etc. Why not in rural communities? It just feels like it doesn't get enough attention what those skills are to be able to work in rural communities. There's a culture there, and therefore we need to develop those cross-cultural competencies as much as everywhere else. I think we have that responsibility to do it. We have the responsibility as evaluators to champion geographic equity, champion for geographic equity, just like any other form of equity, and to really use our skills to break down boundaries and to build sense of community between and among all types of communities. Our current political climate and the presidential race, it's all showing us how important this is for our nation's future to be able to bridge this sort of urban-rural divide that has this weird myth about what it is.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm glad that you talked about sort of developing a better and more accurate understanding of the context and setting of rural communities. And I want to go back to the introduction where we talked about, community science's value add as an evaluation and research organization and consultancy. We really bring in the how, like the practicality when we think about what does it take, right? What are the conditions? What are the methodologies? What are the frameworks in order to make or experience transformative change within organizations and also within communities, right? And so here I really want us to focus on, or I want to hear from you, Kien, on the how when it comes to measuring those equity outcomes in rural settings. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. I think the first thing that I think about, and I've been thinking a lot about, is just how do you apply that definition of equity to rural settings? It seems obvious, but I don't think we say it explicitly. If equity is what I defined earlier, right? People having fair access to opportunities and resources, the ability and the conditions to take advantage of these and their rights to them, then it's the same thing in rural communities, right? How do you apply this definition of lack of access to housing, education, health and healthcare, and economic opportunities in rural settings? And what outcomes can we expect if we were to increase that access? And as we advise everybody to explicitly name who in rural communities would actually benefit from any kind of interventions to increase access. Who in rural communities are being treated unfairly. And if you think of communities existing within communities, when we talk about community, it's sometimes it's the whole rural community, right? And then sometimes it's subpopulations inside a rural community. So we need to name them. We need to be specific, right? And then whose quality of life is going to change if the interventions are successful? Where does power lie in these communities, and what levels of change need to be triggered to effect change? When we were doing the evaluation in Colorado for the Community Partnerships and Health Equity Initiative, we learned that, when we ask people, what disparities are you experiencing? What health disparities or any other form of disparities are you experiencing in your community? And who's experiencing it? And we really learned that it was hard for communities sometimes to separate that out or to even articulate it, because in their mind, it's the entire community. If we're living out here and we don't have access to anything, well, it's not about that one population in our community. It's the whole community, in contrast to a resource-rich community nearby. So that's important to think about. Equally important is then to look inside that one rural community that's experiencing disparities to say, okay, maybe there are other communities inside here that, for whatever reason, for whatever characteristic, are experiencing, more intensive or more intense disparities than others, and to understand that as well. So it's really layering it and looking at it very thoroughly to understand the context and to understand the makeup of that community, where power lies and where the disparities are experienced. And we would do that in any community. So why not in a rural community too? I think the second approach that we have to apply is sort of developing our skills to work across cultures, because rural communities have their own cultures. The experience of having lived in rural communities is really important. Um, but equally important is if we are not in that community, but we're coming in to work in that community, we as evaluators have to have that cross-cultural competency to work there. Right? We would expect that cross-cultural competency if we say we're going to go work in an immigrant community somewhere that has a different experience and speaks a different language. We would expect that. So we should be expecting to develop the same kind of cross-cultural competence skills to be able to work in rural settings. And I've always been on a mindset that you'll never understand everything about a culture, about a place, unless you live and grew up there. It's very hard. And given the way we work in our profession, evaluators come from all over the place. It's not feasible, it's not realistic. In fact, it could even be harmful if we're asking someone to say, learn everything you need to know about this community from a textbook or whatever, right? That's not possible. So what we have to do, and I've always said this from day one, we have to teach ourselves and one another how to not make assumptions about the communities we work in and the people who live there. So it's the same thing. How do we learn not to make assumptions about rural communities and the people who live there? It sounds so easy, right? Not make assumptions, but it's probably the hardest thing we have to do. The hardest thing we have to learn. How do you learn to ask questions respectfully? How do you check your own biases? How do you actually take a step back and know what you don't know and what you don't understand to then know what you need to learn? It sounds simple enough, but it really isn't. I'll always give an example of how, we assume that, everybody raises their children the same way. Well, different cultures raise their children a different way. And it's based on the setting they live in, the culture, the language, everything. So we can't make assumptions that everybody raises their children the same way. So how do you ask those questions respectfully? How do you check your own biases about how you are raised or how you understand children should be raised and how other people raise their children? These are the things that I think, these are the skills that I think we need to develop no matter what community we work in. So again, why not develop them for working rural communities as well?
Yeah, what I love, Kian, is that it feels like you're inviting us into like this level of thoughtfulness, particularly as evaluators, right? Thinking about the specifications of certain communities, thinking about communities within communities, but also thinking about cultures within cultures, right? And not
Yeah.
conflating groups or thinking of them as a monolith. And so I really appreciate that and how you've just given us that invitation to be thinking about that more expansively, regardless of the type of social identity that we're focused in or situated within. And I love how you also talk about just uh, different considerations, right? So doing that homework and doing that research to be sure that
Yeah.
you're prepared and well positioned to be going into a community and respectful of cultural norms and traditions and cultural mores as well. And so I think that's fantastic. And we could really spend so much time here, I think, on the how, but I'm
Yeah.
also curious about some other key considerations, right, for developing that culturally responsive evaluation framework in rural settings, if we're going to be specific about the rural consideration.
Yeah. The first one that comes to mind for me is sort of how do you enter into a rural community? So, as an evaluator, if I have to collect data from quote unquote key informants or community leaders, how do I identify them? Right? Where's my entry point into that community? And the same can be said for any community. So, in rural communities, what Alison Kelly in her book Evaluation in Rural Communities said was that you have to understand and appreciate the specific role of churches, local libraries, sports, and school-based activities like school dances in rural communities. These are places where people naturally gather and connect. And so understanding that and knowing who are those leaders of these institutions and how do you into them to help introduce the evaluation or the research study, to help bring credibility to it, to help you as the evaluator know like what's important to ask and what does this community need, so that you're not just doing an evaluation study for the sake of doing it. Like, how are you going to do an evaluation that will help this community get equity, right? That's important. So those entry points are important, and therefore it's understanding how communities are organized for self-help in rural settings, especially. The second thing is, really being sensitive to and learning about where power lies in rural communities. Again, everything I say here, Faith, can be applied to any community, right? Urban,
Yes.
rural, whatever. Um, so where does power lie? And in rural communities, let's not assume anything about who does and doesn't have power. One of the things we learned in some of our evaluations in rural settings is that, power in rural communities typically lie in the hands of a family who has lived there for generations, or a small group of families who've lived there for generations and who have accumulated a lot of wealth and own many of the resources in the community, right? But they're also people's neighbors, right? So if you're a small community, folks also know them. And so they're your neighbors. I still remember someone saying so clearly to me, how do we organize in a community against the powerful, which equates to against those with the most economic access, when those are also your neighbors and those are also whose kids go to the same school with your kids. And so these are things that we have to be sensitive to. Um, who are the data collectors? Who goes in and who collects the data? And, in rural communities, it's so important because people have relationships with one another. And if you're an outsider, it's more stark than if you were entering into an urban community, right? So who goes in and collects the data? For this immigrant integration initiative evaluation that I did, that I mentioned earlier, we had to conduct community surveys. We had to go in and go door knocking and get community surveys. And we had to really think about who's going to go and do that in the rural communities. The question in front of us was, who'd collect the data? People from outside the community, the evaluation team, who's likely to be viewed with suspicion, or people from inside the community whom everybody was likely to know and felt comfortable with. Well, when we looked into this, I mean, it was easy to say one or the other, right? But when we looked into this, we realized it's a lot more complex. We got feedback from people that, if you have someone from inside the community collect the data, right? Yeah, it helps that people know them and may be comfortable with them, but at the same time, the people who's giving the data might also worry that this means their neighbors will develop intimate knowledge about them and know something about their business, right? So there's no right or wrong answer here. I think it depends on so many things in the community, etc. But it really comes down to just understanding the sensitivities to these things and not take it for granted that, it's a one size solution for everything. And I think lastly, this comes up a lot, especially in Alison Kelly's book. How do you collect data? You have to travel long distances and meet people where they are. You can't expect people to come to you. I remember an evaluation that we had to step in and take over at one point. The criticism of the former evaluator was that they had gone to rural Alaska and they had asked the family members whom they were going to interview to come to this one office, so that they could just do the interviews in one place. Oh, people couldn't get to that office. There was no public transportation. They couldn't get there easy. It would take them a long time to get there. So it was that kind of sensitivity to understand that, no, you have to go to where people are. Which means you have to budget for the time, you have to budget for the cost, you have to budget for the personnel who can do all of these things. So these are just a handful of considerations. There are so many more. And again, I will say it's no different from working in any community, but I think working in rural communities, it just hasn't gotten that attention that we've paid to other kinds of communities. And it's time. It's time that we pay close attention. It's time that we take it seriously because they are part of, our nation. They're part of all the communities that we belong to.
Yeah, that was so succinct and helpful, Ken, and just moving us through some of the considerations to think through when planning for an evaluation in a rural setting and thinking about what are some of those outcomes that we want to see happen. And I love that last piece that you were talking about on just, these communities, rural communities are made up of identities that are everywhere, right? And so if
Hmm.
we're seeing progress being made in certain areas when it comes to other identities, we also want to be sensitive to the fact that rural communities are being left out of the conversation. And how do we think about that in a thoughtful way? And you've laid that out very well, right? So we're thinking about institutions as natural conveners and being able to tap into those spaces, right? Libraries,
Hmm.
gate openers, those who are wearing
Hmm.
multiple hats within a community, but can help to kind of move some action and get buy-in, right? For what kinds of interventions we are hoping to design or implement within a particular community. Also being mindful of who the data collectors are within our community as
Hmm.
well, and identifying those folks and understanding what they bring to the table. And then lastly, thinking about how to be thoughtful about budgeting and being sensitive again to those specific and unique needs. And so that's really, really excellent and helpful. And I love that we sort of took some time to go over considerations. And I want to take us
Actually,
now into,
wait, Faith,
yes,
let me add one more. Sorry,
yes,
I just thought
please.
about it. This other one about collecting data for a social network analysis. And we did that for a project. And typically when you ask a question about who are you connected with, what relationships do you have, you situate it so that the person's identifying the respondent is identify one person or one organization, right? And what we learn in trying to do this in a rural setting is that you have to be so much more thoughtful about the question because one person can wear multiple hats. So one person in a rural community can represent three different institutions. So how do you frame that question differently, right? And then sometimes the respondent may not even know the organization or the institutions the multiple institutions the person represents. They know the person because it's the
Mhm.
relationship, right? And so when you're trying to do this kind of network analysis, you have to take all of that in consideration and ask the questions differently. So that was another example that came to me quickly just now.
Yeah, and it was helpful, right? And painting that full picture. And so we kind of went over some of the considerations. And I'm curious now, Kian, in your estimation, with the experience that you've had, recommendations that you think organizations could really stand to benefit from as they think about evaluation or research that is equity focused and equity specific within rural areas. And it might be something you've already touched on before, but just wanting
Yeah,
to, give some intention to that.
thank you. I agree. I think I've touched on all of it. If I were to try and say this very succinctly, I would say that break down what equity means in rural communities. It looks different than what we think equity means in urban settings. So really take time to understand it, take time to break it down, take time to operationalize it, and then take the time to understand the composition of the community because it's not homogeneous as one would expect. So really understanding the makeup of the community, understanding where power lies in the community, and then thinking about how do you collect your data in a way that's sensitive to that community and its composition and the disparities that it experiences. So again, it's no different, but I will say it over and over. I know I'm such a broken record on this. It's being explicit, it's being intentional, and not glossing over what a rural community is and isn't, and not taking it for granted.
Yeah, I'm hearing so much thoughtfulness and intentionality and what you're saying and just the invitation to be reflective and considerate in our approaches. And I want to take us big picture for a moment to really think about if we're talking, you talked a little bit earlier about different hats, right? So we have the research hat, we have the evaluation hat, but for folks who want to be thinking about long-term outcomes and really thinking about like advocacy, right? What role do you see evaluation or philanthropy for that matter in advocating for policy changes to address some of the social inequities in rural areas?
Um, I think we play a big role. Evaluators, philanthropies, public funders, all of us, we play an important role. we have to lift up the disparities. We have to use, for me personally, is how do we use evaluation to lift up the disparities in rural communities, to bring attention to those things, to help people have an accurate understanding of why those disparities exist, to debunk stereotypes and myths, and then to really use evaluation to support advocacy and power building in these communities so that they can change the conditions and give everybody the the resources and opportunities they need to achieve their full potential. I think that's our responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the word responsibility, right? It's an invitation to be a part of change and making sure that we are affecting change with the knowledge, resources, tools, and access that we have. Absolutely. And so, Ken, this has really been such an informative experience, and I've learned so much from what you've shared and brought into this space. And I'm so grateful for your experience and just sharing your wisdom. And to our last question, which really gets into, the forward thinking vision, long-term transformation. And I'm curious, what do you see or how do you see the field of evaluation evolving over time to be addressing and meeting the needs of equity in rural communities? And then related to that, are there long-term goals for community science, particularly at the intersection of equity in rural communities that you want to bring into this conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Faith, again for your thoughtfulness and your questions and the way you've also reflected what I've said. Thank you. I would say that we have to invest um, the kinds that we have to invest in our learning and our training, and by our I mean evaluators, to be able to work in rural communities just like we've invested in our ability to work in other kinds of communities. I think that that's important. We got to do it. We got to do it now, in order to be able to contribute to building a broader sense of community that includes people in rural communities that we've left out, for the most part. And then in terms of long-term goals, I want community science to take on geographic disparities. We are about community. It's in our name. We work in communities. And geography is one of the ways we define community, right? It's place, it's geography. So therefore, we have to take on geographic disparities. To me, it's a no-brainer. We got to do it. And we can use evaluation to be able to advance equity in rural communities and help bridge that urban-rural divide and hopefully create a less polarized nation and a stronger nation on the whole.
Yeah, that's awesome. And thank you, Ken. Just, thinking about that last point of advancing equity, right? And decreasing polarization, which is so timely for the climate that we're in right now,
Mhm.
as we navigate or think about what our upcoming election cycle will be like. And so I just want to just leave space if there are any final words that you want to share related to this conversation or anything that I may not have asked you that you want to be really clear to just double down on
Mm.
when it comes to equity in rural communities.
I think I just thought about this. It's oftentimes when we talk about working in rural communities, it quickly becomes this perception that it's an either or, right? You work in urban or you work in rural. You value and appreciate the disparities, and the inequities experienced by people of color, or you value those experienced by white people in rural communities. And to me, it's not an either or, right? It's an and both. It's all of it that we have to think about. And we have to be able to hold that complexity. We like to simplify these things into short, simple, cryptic like words and
Mhm.
concepts and checklists. It's not. We're dealing with people, we're dealing with communities, we're dealing with systems. It's inherently complex, and we have to be able to embrace it and to appreciate it and to work with it.
Yeah, that's excellent. And kind of brings to mind to me what we were talking about earlier about communities not being monolithic. And so, how can we
Mhm,
be as specific as possible in our approach and also as prepared and thoughtful as well, so
mhm,
that we are being sensitive to the unique needs and context as well? And so again, Kien, this has just been really informative. I loved everything that you shared, and just how you talked about community science's approach, bringing in again different places and spaces that we've been in to evaluate like how equity is being measured or happening within a particular community. I also love that you brought in other authors and perspectives and frameworks into this conversation, and we'll be careful to kind of link to those pieces of information in the description of this recording. But again, thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation, and I
Thank
look forward
you.
to, as a member of community science, thinking about my role and continuing to advance equity, particularly within rural communities.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Faith. All right.